Welcome to another edition of Monocle Spade, the podcast of epic archaeology, where we explore the world of the Bible and beyond through the lens of history and archaeology. And I'm super excited today to have a really amazing guest. We have archaeologist Dr. Jodi Magness with us today for our podcast. And Jodi is a stellar archaeologist and professor. Just a few things here about her. She is professor of archaeology at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And let me just read a few things about her bio here. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She holds a senior endowed chair in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the Kenan Distinguished Professor of Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism. From 1992 to 2002, Magness was associate and assistant professor of classical and Near Eastern archaeology in the departments of classics and art history at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. She received her BA in archaeology and history from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and her PhD in classical archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1989. In 1990 to 1992, Magness was Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Syro-Palestinian archaeology at the Center for Old World Archaeology and Art at Brown University. She has award-winning books. Three of her books have won awards. Her most recent book, Masada, From Jewish Revolt to Modern Myth, published by Princeton University Press, was selected as a finalist for the 2019 National Jewish Book Award in the category of history, the Gerard and Ella Berman Memorial Award. The Archaeology of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, published by Eerdmans, won the 2003 Biblical Archaeology Society's Award for Best Popular Book in Archaeology. And then also in 2001 and 2002 was selected as an outstanding academic book for 2003. So she has other books that have won awards. She's also won awards for her teaching excellence. And so, Jodi, we are so honored to have you on Monocle Spade. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So here's a big question I have, and you are very well known in the archaeological community, especially in the ancient Near Eastern archaeological community. And so the question I'd like to throw out there for the listeners, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with yourself and your work, it's a really basic question, and people ask me this question a lot. I know you maybe get asked this question, but what got you interested in archaeology? Where did it start?
Yeah, it started a long time ago. It actually started when I was 12 years old. So
Awesome.
I decided I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was 12. And it was thanks to several things. First of all, as often happens with kids, it was a teacher. When I was in 7th grade, we had a class on ancient history, world history, and a very good teacher. I fell in love with ancient Greece and particularly ancient Athens. And at about the same time, I was going to Girl Scout camp and finding fossils of shells. And I had the usual childhood fascination with dinosaurs. And so it all just kind of came together, and I decided I wanted to be an archaeologist. And that's all I ever wanted to be since then. So it's just kind of a one-track mind.
I can totally relate to that. It's funny you say that in Girl Scouts. I was in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and and our leaders would take us to these Civil War battlefields. And I remember going and thinking, man, I want to go dig here, and that's where it started. Okay,
Yeah.
what about any movies or any movies? Of course, it wasn't Indiana Jones, but did you
No,
watch?
it was long before that. That's right. No, it didn't have any. In fact, by the time Indiana Jones and all came out, it was. Although I did enjoy, when I was in high school, I enjoyed reading James Michener's The Source.
Yes, that is a great book.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which of course is modeled after Hatzor and Megiddo in Israel. And
right.
the main archaeologist in it is modeled after Yigael Yadin. So yeah, I enjoyed
cool.
that.
That's very cool. Another question, and this is something the listeners may not be aware of. They may not be aware of this person, but I know you probably know who she is. But Gertrude Bell, what do you think about her? She's just remarkable, I think.
Well, look, I don't know that I'm a specialist on Gertrude Bell in particular. Mainly not because I don't admire her, but my own work does. She didn't work in the geographical region and the time periods that I work in. So I have not actually used any of her work in my own research. But of course, she deserves a lot of credit, like other women of her generation, for being a pioneer.
Yes.
in archaeology. And even today, women have to some extent not broken glass ceilings in
Yeah.
some subdisciplines of archaeology, including what's traditionally called biblical archaeology. And so you have to give all the more credit to women of previous generations like Gertrude Bell.
Definitely. Absolutely. In the modern world, not only yourself, but I think about other women in archaeology are really amazing scholars. And one of the ones I'm thinking about is Sarah Parchek, who won the TED Prize and is doing really amazing work with satellite imagery and technology. And so it's really an exciting time to be alive in doing archaeology. Because of the new technologies that are coming forth, and just the horizons are broad. So thank you for that answer. I watched a documentary on her a while back, and I was just I don't know how I missed understanding Gertrude Bell and knowing who she was, but she really is a pioneer in so many ways, and accomplished a lot of things in Iraq, primarily in Mesopotamia.
Right.
But your work primarily has been in Israel or Palestine, and have you worked in the Transjordan as well?
No, I have not. I did earlier in my career work some in Greece as a graduate student, and I spent a year at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And very early on, I was always focused on the classical world, and particularly on ancient Greece. And in fact, my PhD doctoral exams focused on this. People won't believe this. Focused on Iron Age Greece. So I had sort of a field of minor expertise, if you wish, in Iron Age Greece, which I still find fascinating, by the way.
Wow.
I know, but my field work has always been focused on Israel, and that's because I spent so much time in Israel. And as you may know, when you work in that part of the world, archaeologists in general tend to specialize in geographical regions and time periods. But when you work in that part of the world in particular, you tend to choose, I suppose, a side in the sense of where you're going to do your work, which side of the border. Because of modern politics, it's not that easy. It can be done, and there are people who do it, but it's not that easy to move, and have projects on both sides of the border there.
Yep.
So even with peace treaties and all. So not to say it can't be done, and there aren't people who do it, but generally people tend to work on what. So my field work has been pretty much focused in Israel. And, I've never really had it. Not that I don't find other places interesting, but there's just so much still to do in Israel that I've never felt a need to move somewhere else. And fortunately, even with all of the political situation there and everything, I've never felt unsafe or that I couldn't continue my field work there. So I never felt a need to leave the country and find somewhere else to work.
Very good. You had said earlier, just a second ago, that you sort of your area is classical studies. So since I have you on our podcast, I've got to ask you this question that I've studied this question too, and it's sort of a side little interest that I have, and that's classical archaeology, and that's Heinrich Schliemann and digging in Troy. Do you think there is some historical kernel of truth to the Trojan legend and the Iliad and the Odyssey? And do you, not really?
Yeah.
Be honest.
I will be honest. And the honest answer is that I have no dogs in that fight.
Okay.
I have plenty of dogs in other fights. But I think that with regard to, so I think most classical archaeologists, I think this is probably safe to say, would agree that Hisarlik, which is that mound, is ancient Troy. The question is the degree of historicity in Homer's account of the Trojan War, which of course was composed centuries later. And it's a methodological question that's a little bit similar to the story of biblical archaeology, right? And how much of the biblical account is historical. So it's kind of like that. So depending on who you ask, either more or less of the Homeric account is in fact historical. So yes, that's what I would say. I would say that I don't think that any credible archaeologist thinks that what Homer describes is literally true and accurate. The question is, how many of those elements can you trace back? And there are, in fact, elements in Homer's account that have a Bronze Age setting, right? Some of the descriptions, for example, of the weapons, the type of weapons that are used, the way that the dead are treated, cremation versus inhumation. So there are certain things that certainly are more appropriate to a Bronze Age setting. But that doesn't mean that the whole account is historical, that the Trojan War, as it's described, actually took place in that way.
Yes. Several years ago, British historian Michael Wood did a series,
Yes.
and it was really good, I think.
In Search of Troy, I think.
In Search of Troy, that's right.
Yeah, and
yes.
that was actually excellent. I think there's also a popular book that he published.
That's correct.
Semi-popular. Yeah.
Yes, I've got a copy of that. It's really good. It reminds me when you were talking, when you giving your answer, it reminded me of a book titled by Dr. William Deaver, who's now retired. What did the biblical writers know, and when did they know it? Such a great title, because it really cuts to the heart of the relationship between the Old Testament and the archaeological record. But not only that, but also like with Troy, what did Homer know, and when did he know it? Did he write about these things that are?
And even by the way, was there a Homer?
Yeah.
There's no agreement about that either, right? Or was there a single individual named Homer who composed these epics, or was it more than one person? And anyway, there's a whole debate about that too.
Fascinating. So let's get into a lot of our listeners. They're Bible readers. They study these biblical archaeology and things like that. And I know that your area, sort of archaeologically excavating in Israel, has been primarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I would call Second Temple Judaism, in that period leading up to the period of Jesus in the early church. So what I'd like to do is ask you a couple of questions about Herod the Great and how he came to power, and what was the situation politically like in Israel before Jesus was born, and sort of leading up to that. So one of the things that I've read about, and of course about as well, is that the Judaism as it was practiced in the New Testament was sort of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and maybe perhaps those other groups, sort of got developed a couple hundred years before Jesus got on the scene. So could you describe that maybe in an easy to understand way for our listeners, sort of the situation politically, the Hasmoneans, and maybe how Herod came to power before the New Testament?
Wow, that's a huge question.
Yeah, I was trying to think of
the world.
That. Yeah, that's a big question.
Okay, so to put it into a nutshell.
Yeah.
How shall we start this? So in the third, I'm going to use the terms BC and AD to make it easier on your listeners, rather than BCE and CE. It is not a theological statement on my part.
Okay.
In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, Rome had been expanding its power outside of the area of the Italian peninsula, both to the west and to the east. So as Rome moved into the Eastern Mediterranean, it began to take over some of the kingdoms in the region. And it moved progressively eastward, swallowing up these kingdoms, which for the most part are what we call Hellenistic kingdoms, that is, kingdoms that were formed after the death of Alexander the Great. Mm-hmm. And one of the kingdoms, in this case it's a teeny little kingdom, that existed in this region was the Hasmonean Kingdom. The Hasmonean Kingdom had been created when the Jews living in, and now again a term, I'm going to use the term Palestine here, not in relation to the modern political conflict, but in the British mandatory sense, of sort of encompassing what is today the modern state of Israel, the Palestinian territories, and parts of Transjordan. So in the area of Palestine, a Jewish, an independent Jewish kingdom had been established in the middle of the 2nd century BC, when the local Jewish population had revolted against the rule of one of Alexander's Greek successors. And they established independence, and they were ruled by the leaders of the revolt and their successors. That revolt is what's called the Maccabean Revolt, celebrated by the modern Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. And they and their successors are called the Hasmoneans, and so we call it the Hasmonean Kingdom. And so over the course of time, by the way, the Hasmonean Kingdom, when it was first established, was tiny. It was the area around Jerusalem, basically, but over time, they expanded their control into neighboring areas. So in the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome takes over the Hasmonean Kingdom. This happened as a result of a quarrel between two brothers who were supposed to take over the Hasmonean throne over who was going to take over. Rome comes in and takes over control. And there's a hugely complicated series of events, but so I'm going to really terribly oversimplify.
Fine.
And just say that when the Romans came in and took over the Hasmonean Kingdom, they annexed it to Rome. And by the way, Rome is not yet an empire at this point. It's a republic. It's the period of the late republic. When the Romans come in, they decide to dismember the Hasmonean Kingdom. They rightly, by the way, I think, suspected that if they left the Hasmoneans in control on behalf of Rome, that the Hasmoneans would not be loyal to Rome. And they took a man who had worked in the Hasmonean administration and placed him in charge together with one of the Hasmoneans. And that man was a man named Antipater, who was the son of a convert to Judaism. He was an Idumean, an Arab man who had been converted, whose father had been converted previously by the Hasmoneans to Judaism. What happens eventually is that after Antipater is killed, and there's a series of other events, the Romans take Herod, who was the older son of Antipater, and appoint him as client king of what's called Judea, the area around Jerusalem, on their behalf. And Herod then rules this kingdom for quite a long time, from 40 BC until his death in 4 BC. Over the course of Herod's very long reign, his kingdom was increased in size by the Romans. And therefore, it eventually came to include both territories that were Jewish, but also territories that were not Jewish. And so Herod, in ruling this kingdom, had a challenge, how to keep both his Jewish and his non-Jewish populations happy. And he, within his Jewish territories in particular, had a problem in that the Jews did not view him as a legitimate king because he had been appointed by Rome and he was not descended from the Hasmoneans. He was also, by the way, only half Jewish on his father's side of the family through forced conversion. His mother was not Jewish. His mother was a Nabatean or an Arab woman. And so Herod faced a lot of opposition from different sectors within the Jewish population. And that was one of the big challenges that he faced throughout his reign. The Jewish population itself was far from monolithic. Jews have always disagreed with each other. There's a saying today, where you have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions. And in antiquity, that was equally true. So there were a lot of disagreements among members of the Jewish population that, as you said, by this time had resulted in the formation of different groups, or what are called sects, the best known of whom are the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Jesus's movement. And so this is also one of the factors that Herod had to contend with, which was the ongoing tension and conflict between these sectarian groups, which, by the way, as I think you rightly hinted, were not just religious groups, but they were also political groups. They supported different sides in political, political debates, both in the Hasmonean period and afterwards.
Let me interrupt at this point. Thank you, and I'm sorry for such a broad question. I realize that's a huge question, and I should have framed it in a little different manner. But thank you. That was exactly what I was looking for, and really what I wanted to really get at was, in these factions, in these different Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and of course with Herod being an Idumean and not really a Jew, he did fear the Jews. He didn't really fear the Romans, right?
Well, okay, so let me just clarify and say this question of whether Herod was really a Jew or not is very hard.
Yeah.
Because, of course, according to Jewish law today, which is rabbinic law, which developed in the centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple, according to Jewish law today, to be Jewish, your mother has to be Jewish, right? So Judaism today is traced from the mother's side of the family. It's matrilineal descent. But as Shia Cohen has showed, that principle did not necessarily exist in the late Second Temple period in the time of Herod, or if it did exist, it was not necessarily universally accepted by all Jews. And so the question of whether Herod was Jewish, not Jewish, fully Jewish, half Jewish, there's one passage where Josephus calls him half Jew. It's not quite clear. I actually think that the main opposition to Herod was because he was not Hasmonean. So, he was not descended from the line of the Hasmoneans. The question of his Jewishness is a whole nother matter. So I'd sort of prefer to leave that aside.
Okay,
sorry.
Thank you. No, very good. Which really was kind of dovetails with another question, and that is, within these groups, Was there a concern of being too Hellenized? In other words,
Well,
what's the situation
yeah,
there?
so I mean, again, that's one of these. So there's a lot of debate among scholars today about the use of terms like Hellenized, Hellenization, meaning that you've become kind of Greek culture oriented, or Romanized, Romanization.
Right.
And a lot of scholars today prefer actually to avoid using those kinds of terms, both because it creates a dichotomy. You're either on one side or the other side. And of course, things are never that simple. And also because it implies a lack of agency, right? So you become Hellenized, you're not an agent, you're not in control of your own decisions. I will say that while I understand all of the reasons why many of my colleagues do not like using those terms, I still use them because it's hard to find a substitute. So I do use those terms, but with those cautionary notes. But I do want to say that so I don't think that the debates among Jews concerned the degree of Hellenization per se. The debates among Jews concerned, and this has always been the case, have concerned the proper interpretation and practice of the laws in the 5 books of Moses, right? Biblical law. And so the question is to what extent then would you, if you adopted some of those Hellenized or Romanized practices, would that then cause you to transgress the proper observance of the law, right? So it's clear, by the way, that overall the Jewish population, in fact, no matter whether they adopted Greek or Roman cultural elements in their everyday life, it's clear that everybody pretty much observed the laws in the 5 books of Moses, but they may have interpreted and observed them differently from each other, right? So for example, it's pretty clear, I think, that the overwhelming majority of Jews were not eating pork at this time. Okay, that's pretty clear. But on the other hand, some Jews, for example, felt comfortable using imported fine pottery, which was manufactured by Gentiles, right? And which therefore, in the eyes of other Jews, might be considered impure, according to biblical Jewish law, depending on your interpretation of biblical Jewish law.
Exactly.
So those are the kinds of things, right? And so depending on your interpretation of the law, you may or may not incorporate more Greek or Roman elements in your everyday lifestyle.
Got it.
And so the houses that Nachman Avigad excavated in Jerusalem's Jewish quarter in the 1970s, which he thought, and I actually agree with him, probably belonged in many cases to groups that were called Sadducees or would have identified as Sadducees. That is the elite, right? Clearly, they had adopted many elements of the Greek and Roman lifestyle, right? The houses are decorated in the latest Greek and Roman fashion. They have imported dishes in them. They have a lot of stone furniture that is carved in Roman style. But at the same time, it's clear that they were also observing Jewish law, biblical Jewish law, because the houses have many ritual baths in them. So they were observing the ritual purification laws. And they have stone vessels, many stone vessels in them, which also are connected with the observance of Jewish purity laws. So, yeah. So it's complicated, right? And a lot of it is actually socioeconomic, because the absence of Greek and Roman fashions could simply indicate that these were people who didn't have the means to acquire, imported pottery or decorate their houses with mosaic floors.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah, maybe they wanted them and they just couldn't afford them.
Right. I mean, they're just struggling to survive, right?
Exactly. I had read an article a while back where I'm not exactly sure where this was, but near Cana, they actually found a quarry where perhaps the 6 water pots, which were ritual purity. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that discovery.
Sure. Well, look, so there's that reference in John, right? The Gospel of John to the wedding at Cana and the large jars that contain water that Jews use for ritual purification. And what is described there seems to correspond, most scholars I think agree, corresponds with a particular type of stone vessel that is kind of a large crater called a kalal. And we do, in fact, have quarries for these stone vessels in Galilee. So whether it's the one at Cana or not, we don't know. There's no way to know because we don't have the actual stone jars from the Gospel of John.
Exactly.
We only have the reference. If we had the actual jars, then you could probably do analyses of the stone and see where the stone came from, right? But
yes.
We don't have that. But yes, but there are stone quarries that have been discovered around Galilee. And of course also around Jerusalem, right?
That's right. So for our listeners, and I know that, well, I guess you and I are speaking because we're on the same page, but for our listeners who are maybe not familiar with this, maybe you could describe it easily. Why was drinking out of stone vessels, why did they consider that to be in accordance with the law? How did that get, that's, of course, Second Temple Judaism is one of the indicators of Second Temple Judaism is drinking from stone vessels, and then also with the mikvot, ritual purity. And also I'd read, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, that some of the ritual purity of the mikvot actually maybe has roots in Greco-Roman culture. And so I don't know if that's true or not.
Oh, okay. So,
it's an article I read on.
All right. Oh, wow. Okay. You asked another huge question. So let me explain about the ritual purity in Judaism in general, and then try and answer your questions. So the 5 books of Moses, what Jews call the Torah, or in Greek is called the Pentateuch,
right,
contain laws that Jews believe God gave his people Israel. These laws govern various aspects of everyday life, moral behavior, how the God of Israel wants his people to worship him, and all sorts of stuff like that. And among these laws are purity laws. These purity laws state that there are certain things that cause a person to become ritually impure. So these things that cause ritual impurity fall into 2 main categories. Things that you touch, that you come into contact with, and certain natural processes. Now, many scholars have tried to figure out why certain things cause ritual impurity and certain things do not. It's not an obvious system. And many people greater than me have tried to figure it out, and there's no consensus about it. So we won't try to figure it out, but I will describe it. So things that, and they're very random. So there are things that you would think would cause ritual impurity, which don't, but things which do cause ritual impurity, which it's like, why would, anyway. So of things that you touch, for example, these are just examples. Touching a lizard causes you to be ritually impure. Touching mildew on the walls of a house. Touching a corpse, that's the worst kind of ritual impurity. Natural processes include, for example, for men, having a nocturnal emission. For women, things like childbirth and menstruation cause ritual impurity. Now, notice, by the way, that the things that cause ritual impurity are not only random, but they're unavoidable. If you are a living, breathing human being, that is, at multiple times during your life, you will unavoidably become ritually impure, which means that, at least in the Hebrew Bible, becoming ritually impure is not connected with being sinful in the Christian sense of the word. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're evil. It simply means you're ritually impure. Now, how do you become ritually pure? Once you become ritually impure, because you will. So for most Jews and for most kinds of ritual impurity, what you're supposed to do is immerse yourself in what the Hebrew Bible calls living water and wait for the passage of a certain amount of time, usually until sundown, and then you're purified again. By the late Second Temple period, Jews had come to understand living water as meaning any body of water that is not mechanically filled, not drawn. So a river, a stream, a lake, a pool of water left after a rainfall can be used as long as there's enough water in it to completely cover you. You can lie down, but all the water has to come into contact with all surfaces of your body. You cannot mechanically fill a pool with water. So you can't take a hose and fill it. You can't take buckets and fill it. You can dig a channel from a source of water and let the water flow naturally into an artificial pool. That's okay. And that is what we call Jewish ritual baths or mikvaot, and those become very common in the late Second Temple period, by which I mean by the time of Jesus. And so now, by this point, some of your listeners or viewers or whatever might be wondering, well, this sounds like a pain in the neck of a way to live, right? every time you come into contact with one of these things, random things, or have one of these unavoidable natural processes, you have to go and look for a pool of water to dunk yourself in and then wait till whatever, sundown. What kind of a way is that to live? The fact of the matter is that that's not how it worked. In fact, it's clear that these laws of ritual purity applied mainly, not only, but mainly to one situation, and that was coming into contact with the presence of the God of Israel. When you as a Jew, and by the way, these laws apply only to Jews, not to Gentiles, because Gentiles were not allowed into the presence of the God of Israel. So they apply only to Jews. So when you as a Jew entered the presence of the God of Israel, you first had to be ritually pure. Or if you were producing first fruits that were being sent to the temple in Jerusalem, you had to be ritually pure, right? They had to be produced in a state of ritual purity. But for most Jews, on an everyday basis, it was not necessary to observe these laws. And most Jews, in fact, did not on an everyday basis observe them, didn't worry about it on an everyday basis. And by the way, today people might think, well, but wait a minute, God is around me, all the time, right? God's omnipresent. He's everywhere. She's everywhere. Shouldn't we be ritually pure all the time? But it doesn't work like that either, because in ancient Judaism, the idea was that God dwelled in his house, which was the Jerusalem temple on the Temple Mount. So when you as a Jew entered the temple in Jerusalem, you first had to purify yourself, but otherwise on an everyday basis, most Jews did not worry about that. One of the big exceptions to that rule is the Qumran sect associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which observed these laws very strictly and on a regular basis, because they constituted themselves, their sect, as a substitute temple or desert sanctuary, believing that God, the presence of God, dwelled in their midst, right? And so they observed these laws more regularly. Now, one of the problems that I have with the way many people look at ancient Judaism is that they tend to think of Judaism as something that is different and peculiar from everything else that's going on around it. And so things get divorced and taken out of their context when they should not be. And so when we look at these laws of ritual purity, they're often discussed, sort of like as if this is only the Jews are doing this, when in fact, pretty much all ancient religions had similar purity laws. So this goes back to your question. In fact, pretty much all ancient religions had similar, not identical, but similar purity laws that governed things like entering a temple precinct or a sanctuary or offering a sacrifice or whatever.
Yes.
And so it's very important to remember. And in fact, by the way, some of these are still preserved in living religions today. I mean, you go to India and there are temples in India where there are signs, and I've been to India, right? There are signs that say at the entrance, women who are menstruating are not allowed into the temple, for example, right?
Right.
So Judaism, right.
Yeah.
So Judaism is simply doing what pretty much everybody else is doing. Of course, there are differences, but big picture, it's just like everybody else. So the question that you asked, could it be that Jewish ritual baths were influenced by Greek and Roman installations? I actually don't agree with that. I know that it's been suggested. I don't see evidence of that. I think that if you look at the Greek and Roman world, you don't see quite this. You see baths and things. So the idea to have a bath, a stepped pool, sure, there were stepped pools in the Greek and Roman world, but nothing like what we have in Jewish ritual baths, which are being placed mainly, not only for the purposes of ritual purification, right? They're not designed as cisterns, they're designed as ritual baths. When you do have stepped bathtubs in the Greek and Roman world, or I should say in the Greek world, because we're looking at precursors, they're usually built above ground. They're usually like a bathtub, right? Above ground, and then you have steps and you get in. Whereas mikvaot are dug into the ground. So I personally don't agree with that. I know it's been suggested, but I do think it's important to remember that Jews were not the only ones who had these kind of purity laws, that they were pretty much ubiquitous. And anybody coming from other parts of the classical world to ancient Judea, to Jerusalem, would have wouldn't have thought twice, would have said, well, maybe there are a couple of things that the Jews are doing a little differently than everybody else is doing, but, it would have, big picture, been pretty much understood. And it's, by the way, not understood by modern Westerners today, including most modern Jews, right?
That's right. So thank you. What an excellent explanation of that. And then just a little bit of a follow-up question. John the Baptist, so when he came, is there any connection between John and his baptism in the Jordan and this ritual purification? What is the connection?
Yeah, well, there is, but exactly what the connection is would depend on who you ask.
That's true.
So everybody has different opinions about that. But there's no doubt that, this practice of immersion in living water, in this case, the Jordan River, right, for the purposes of purification is connected with, and so what happens though in Christianity that is different from the way it originates in Judaism is that in Christianity, baptism becomes a one-time event for the cleansing of sin.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas in Judaism, what you have is a more, let's say, mechanical process that you have to do over and over again every time you become impure, right? Now, what's the question is, how does this idea that this is connected with the cleansing from sin, right? Where does that enter, right? And certainly we see that in John. And so one of the things that's interesting about Qumran is that you do see at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, the Qumran sect, you see this connection. So at Qumran, you do have ritual purification for all the normal reasons in Judaism, but it's also clear that at Qumran there is an idea that it's also cleansing you from sin, right? That there's some sort of a connection there. So exactly what that connection is, that's where does that come from? Right. There are some passages in the Hebrew Bible, for example, in some of the prophetic books, that suggest a direction like this. I would recommend, if people are interested, Joan Taylor, a long time ago, wrote a book on John the Baptist. I think it was called John the Baptizer. That I think is a very good discussion of this. My colleague over at Duke, I know I'm at UNC, I'm not supposed to mention Duke, but we actually get along very well in everything except basketball. But my colleague at Duke, Joel Marcus, just published a book about John the Baptist, which is getting a lot of attention. And so I'm not saying I agree, disagree, or whatever, but at any rate, so there's plenty of scholarly literature about, how exactly this idea of cleansing from sin enters what is clearly originally a Jewish practice that does not seem to have a connection with cleansing from sin, right?
It is a fascinating question, and I wish we had more time, but I don't want to take all your time up, but I want to sort of round everything off today. And thank you again so much for, I told you earlier, I'm not going to ask you any loaded questions, and here I am asking you a couple of really difficult questions. I apologize. Okay. But let me get in. I mean, all of this is your wheelhouse. This is where you live and breathe, and this has been your work for years. But I'm really interested. I saw a lecture. Some people may have watched this, and if you have never seen this, I'll really recommend that our listeners get on YouTube and look at Jodi's lecture on Masada at Penn. And it is absolutely excellent. I've watched it 3 times, and I learn something every time I watch it. It's just such a great a summary of Masada. So as many of you know, Jodi, we just actually got through explaining a few minutes ago about Herod and how he really wasn't very popular among the Jewish population because he was not a Hasmonean, correct? And he built these palace fortresses all throughout Palestine. And I've been looking for the past couple of years about numbers of palace fortresses, and what is it, the number now, about 15 of them total or 11? I don't know the number.
Well, I think it depends on how you count them.
Okay.
How many there are, but certainly there is a line of fortresses along the southeastern frontier of his kingdom, right?
Yeah. Okay. And 2 really famous ones I want to mention because we don't have time to get into it, but I want to mention it. One of them is Herodium, which is where Herod was very likely buried, according to Josephus.
No, he was buried.
Was buried there, yes.
Don't get me started on Herodium.
Well, I agree with you there.
No, I actually, so I have more recently, I published a very long article in the Journal of Ancient Judaism that came out in December. about Herod's tomb at Herodium.
Cool.
Because, you know, Herodium is, well, now I'm going to get off on Herodium, but if you will allow me. But
go ahead.
Because, so, you know, Herodium is the only, so Herodium is one of Herod's fortified desert palaces, right?
Right.
But it's also the only site that Herod built and named after himself. He always named everything he built after someone, but Herodium is the only one, apparently, that he named after himself. And he named it after himself, apparently, because he planned it to be his final resting place after his death and an everlasting memorial to himself. And we know this because Josephus tells us that when Herod died in 4 BC, in spring of 4 BC at his palace in Jericho, his winter palace in Jericho, his body was taken by procession to Herodium and he was buried there. Now, Ehud Netzer, who was an Israeli archaeologist who spent many, many years excavating sites associated with Herod, including Herodium, spent a very long time looking for Herod's tomb at Herodium. We archaeologists debated for a very long time where exactly Herod was buried at Herodium. His tomb had not been found. Herodium is this artificial conical shaped mountain. There are structures built inside the top of it, which is like the crater of a volcano. And then there were also buildings at the base of it. And there was a debate, was Herod buried in the top or inside the mountain or at the base of the mountain? And Netzer literally spent decades looking for the tomb. And finally, in 2007, he discovered the tomb, which turned out to be a mausoleum halfway up the side of the mountain. And actually, as I write in my article, and I have actually said this too, unfortunately, the discovery of Herod's tomb at Herodium, which I personally consider to be the single most important archaeological discovery in Palestine since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, that discovery, that very important discovery, was overshadowed because at the same time it was discovered and announced, a false documentary falsely claiming that the tomb of Jesus and his family had been discovered in Jerusalem.
Wow.
That was broadcast at the same time on the Discovery Channel, and that sucked out all of the public attention. And the very important discovery of Herod's tomb at Herodium kind of got overlooked in all of the noise. The reason why I say I think the discovery of Herod's tomb at Herodium is so important is because we don't have any firsthand information about Herod. We don't have anything that he wrote himself that has come down to us telling us what Herod thought, what he did. What we have are accounts of others, mostly filtered. So Josephus, who is probably the main source for Herod, right, draws on a lost biography of Herod by Nicolaus of Damascus. And the way that Josephus presents Herod is in a very negative way. So what we have with Herod's tomb at Herodium, firsthand, is Herod telling us how he wanted to be remembered for posterity. And so I wrote this very long article about it. There have been, as you know, some people have questioned, some of my colleagues have questioned whether in fact the mausoleum that Netzer discovered is the tomb of Herod because there are no inscriptions associated with the mausoleum or the sarcophagi there. I believe actually for various reasons, and I don't think we have time to go into it, but I think, again, if people are interested, they can look up the Journal of Ancient Judaism for December of 2019 and look at it, that for various reasons, it is indisputable that this, in fact, is the tomb of Herod. And as a consequence, and I'm just going to throw this out as a firebomb and I won't explain it, but I think that one of the things that we see from the mausoleum of Herod, and this is something that was already suggested a long time ago by a very eminent scholar on Herod whose name was, sorry, I'm blanking now. Anyway, never mind. So one of the things that I throw out, that I'm going to throw out, is that I think that the tomb of Herod, the mausoleum of Herod at Herodium, shows us that Herod claimed to have fulfilled the expectations associated with the Jewish Messiah.
Wow.
And I think that there are a lot of pieces of evidence that indicate this. So it's a complex story.
But it makes sense, though. It makes sense of the data, I think.
It does, actually. But in order to be able to break it down and explain it to you, I would have to take another probably half hour on your show. So it is complex, but yeah.
That is fascinating, and I agree. I don't have the credentials that you do, but I can totally see that. And is this in your article?
It's all in my article. So, and I believe that you can probably easily access the Journal of Ancient Judaism.
Okay.
For December of 2019, if you or your listeners are interested.
Okay. Perhaps academia.edu or
academia. Well, sure.
That's a
I have to. I'm ashamed now. I'm ashamed. I know everybody puts their stuff up on academia. You
That's
can see
okay.
I'm turning red because I'm ashamed. I've never set up an academia page, and it's partly laziness on my part, and it's partly the time, it's partly like at this point, it's the idea of trying to upload so many things is overwhelming. And so maybe one of these days I'll find some research money and have a student do it for me. I don't. So, if somebody's really super interested, I'd be happy to send a PDF, but so my academia, I don't put it up on academia.
Well, I think your website is excellent resource, so people can check it out.
Yeah.
Well, let me finish up with this, and thank you so much for that. We could talk all day. Obviously, neither one of us have time, but let's finish up with this. So, in your excavation at Masada, you were following in the footsteps of Yigayal Yadin, correct? And I'm not sure. Well, really, you were excavating the Roman siege works. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And so in your lecture, you had talked about, you were kind of describing some of the questions. What were some of the research questions? Well, let me back up and get my ducks in a row here. I get excited about this because this is really a fascinating subject. Number one, how many seasons did you excavate there? That's a simple question. Number two, what were some of the research questions or maybe that you were kind of going into it that you wanted to find out? And then what were some new things that you discovered when you've excavated there?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that. I'll just a little background. So we're talking about now the summer of 1995, June and July 1995. I was invited to co-direct, so I don't want to present myself as either the director or even the primary director.
Okay.
The principal investigator was Professor Gideon Ferster of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the two other co-directors were Chaim Goldfuss and Benny Arubas. So I was a co-director of those excavations, and I was invited by Gideon. And we worked for only one season, 6 weeks, in the summer of 1995. The decisions, therefore, of what we did, we made our decisions more or less together, but they were not my sole decisions. Let me say, so it wasn't I decided. But what we did decide to do was we wanted to investigate in that time that we had one of the two legionary camps. The bottom of Masada is surrounded by Roman siege camps, 8 in all, and the camps housed the soldiers who participated in the siege at Masada, who were either legionary or auxiliary soldiers. And we know from the way the Roman army operated and from previous work that's been done that 2 of the camps housed the legionary troops, the members of the 10th Legion at Masada, and the others housed auxiliary troops. So the 2 big camps of the legionary camps, one of them, B, is on the east side of the mountain. The other one, F, is on the northwest side of the mountain. And we decided to focus on Camp F because it was the better preserved of the 2 legionary camps. And it was positioned in a spot where the commander of the Roman troops at Masada, Flavius Silva, was able to oversee the construction of the assault ramp up the western side of the mountain. So we focused our excavations on certain units inside Camp F, particularly units located in the center of the camp. And because the Roman army operated in such a standardized manner, we pretty much knew what we were going to find in each area. So you always know, for example, where the camp headquarters is going to be located, right? The Principia, where the Praetorium, which is the tent unit of the commander, where that's going to be located. So that's kind of the area we focused on in our excavations. My own contribution to the excavation, aside from bringing students and, you know, working in the field, was the pottery, which is my expertise. I published the pottery from the excavations. And so I was particularly interested in what kind of pottery the Romans were using in the field, which sounds like a kind of a weird question, but actually it was really interesting because it goes to how the Romans provisioned their troops during a siege, especially in a desolate and remote place like Masada, right, where they have supply lines, you know, going for a long distance. I was particularly interested because I had just worked on pottery from the 10th Legion's kiln works in Jerusalem, which were excavated also by Chaim Goldfuss and Benny Arubas not too long before that. And I was interested to see, well, what was the 10th Legion using the pottery that was being made in the kiln works in Jerusalem in the siege of Masada or not? And the question was not. Actually, they did not. No, it was interesting. Nothing at all.
Wow.
In fact, yeah, no, it's very interesting. In fact, what it revealed, what the excavations at Masada revealed, was that we had the corpus of pottery consisted overwhelmingly of locally made, what are called bag-shaped storage jars, which are used for storing goods, provisions. Mm-hmm. Very small number of cooking pots, and a very small number of things like imported Nabatean bowls or things like that, painted bowls. And so it's clear that what the Romans were doing when in provisioning their troops at Masada was bringing in produce, so water, animal fodder, grain, wine, whatever, bringing it in from long distances across the Dead Sea, but also probably overland, in probably portable containers, by which I mean skins, baskets, things like that, that can be easily transported on the back of an animal, a pack animal. And then when they got to Masada, the provisions would be emptied into these bag-shaped storage jars, which once they're filled, they're very hard to pick up and carry around, would be emptied into these bag-shaped storage jars, and that contained the, you know, the food and water that the Romans were using. But the Romans didn't, but there was almost no pottery associated with cooking and dining. So almost no cooking pots, almost no bowls or dishes or things like that. And the reason for that is because when Romans conducted a military campaign in the field, each soldier was equipped with a mess kit. Oh. So they used their mess kits in the field for cooking and preparing their food. But the provisions were brought in and then were emptied and stored in these bag-shaped storage jars. So it was actually very interesting what I learned from the pottery.
Very cool. One of the things that I think I remember from the lecture is also that did you guys cut across the siege ramp going up into the fortress itself? Yes. And something that I would like you to sort of just touch base on with our listeners is that there's sort of this common maybe misconception that people have that perhaps Jews are the ones, they basically the Romans enslaved Jews to build the siege ramp, and that's not the case at all, is it?
Well, yeah, so there is a very common misconception today, and if you go to Israel and you go on a tour of Masada, or you stand around and you listen to tour guides, you will at some point hear somebody saying something about, and the Jews built, you know, the siege ramp, the assault ramp, and the siege works, and that's simply not true. Now, the siege works were built by Romans. And in fact, another myth, by the way, about Masada, and you know, sort of a widespread misconception, is that the siege took 3 years. People think it took 3 years because Jerusalem fell in 70 and Masada fell either in 73 or 74. There's a debate about chronology. So people think the siege took 3 years. It did not. The Romans arrived at the foot of Masada either in 72 or 73, and the mountain fell either in 73, 74, meaning over the winter spring of 72, 73, or the winter spring of 73, 74. And there have been detailed calculations done of this, showing that the entire siege took no more than 6 months, but probably much less than that, probably more like 2 months from the very beginning to the end. And the reason is, again, because the Roman army at this point was a professional standing army. This is what each Roman soldier did for their for their life. This was their career. They were trained to do this. So when the Romans arrived at the foot of Masada, these kinds of siege works, this is what they were trained to build. Now, were Jewish slaves employed in the work? They were. Josephus actually refers to Jewish slaves at Masada, right. But they were more what you could call in Yiddish schleppers, right? They were the ones who were doing the hard work of carrying stuff around, right? So if you had to like get stuff carried or whatever, but the actual construction was done by the Roman army. Again, this is what they were trained to do.
Sort of like the Corps of Engineers, if you will. They were
something like that.
Yeah, yes. They're professional soldiers and very efficient. That's one of the things that when you study ancient Rome, and you know this perhaps better than anyone, they were, and no matter what kind of judgments you want to say about ancient Rome, they were very efficient at their administration of their kingdom, at least during the Republic and maybe during the early Empire. Maybe later it sort of broke down, but for the most part, I mean, you can't rule over half of the ancient Mediterranean without having some kind of organizational skills.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's right. So, what happened is the Roman army originally, when it started out in the time of the Republic, so in the first centuries BC, was a volunteer. Was an army built on a draft, right? So of citizen soldiers. Yep. So you had to sort of serve a certain term in the army. You were required to. And then at some point, as we go into the period of the empire, Rome realizes that it needs a professional army. Right. These sort of farmers who are drafted into service for a couple of years at a time, that won't do. And they create a professional army, which is based on, it's a volunteer army, right? But when you sign up for a lifetime, right. Pretty much. And then that's what you're trained to do. And so it's almost like, in a way, what happened in the US, right? When we went here from the draft, which we had back in the time of Vietnam, for those people who remember that, right? You had a mandatory draft versus what we have now, which is that you sign up, right, for the army voluntarily. So, or for military service. So it's kind of like that.
Yeah. So the final question is, and I hope this is not a loaded question, and you can give the simplest answers you can. I don't think it's a hard question. So Jerusalem, of course, is an amazing place with a lot of history. On the Temple Mount area, of course, you can't excavate there now, correct? It's off limits. But every now, and you know this is so true, Dr. Magness, that in archaeology, you've got all kinds of crazy theories, I'm sure you've heard everything before. And I get this too. People ask me questions. I get people emailing questions about what do I think about this, what do I think about that. But in the past couple of years or so, there have been some theories and books out there about maybe perhaps the Jerusalem temple, the one that was destroyed in 70 AD, the one that Herod's Second Temple, we call, was actually not on the Temple Mount itself. It was actually in the city of David. I tend to believe that that's not the case at all. And I'm not sure if you know who Dr. Leen Rittmeyer is. Do you know Leen?
Yeah.
He's
Len.
Yeah, I know Len. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he excavated in Jerusalem, I believe, with Benjamin Mazar back in the 70s. And so, what is your opinion on?
Len says that? Are you sure?
Not Len. I'm not sure.
No, it's not Len.
No, he doesn't say that. No.
He does not say that. Okay, good. Because I was going to have a cow if you were saying that he said that.
No. I'm not saying he says that. I'm saying he says against that. He
said, of course he is. Yeah, because Len knows, right.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
Right. So unfortunately, look, so I'll just say, I'm sorry to cut you off there, but unless you want to go.
No. All I'm saying is that he would actually disagree with these theories because he actually has credentials.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Right. So, okay. So the theory that you're referring to, so I will not name names, but I will say that the theory that you are referring to the best of my knowledge, has not been suggested by a professional archaeologist, somebody who has credentials, academic credentials in archaeology.
Correct.
And it is unfortunate, in my opinion, that this kind of sensational theory gets so much attention among the public, but that's the way it is. The fact is that I think it's probably safe to say that no credible archaeologist accepts that at all and gives it, I mean, I've never for a minute even thought about it as a remote possibility. And so, yes, Len Rittmeyer is in good company in rejecting that. So there's no support for it, and it's not an academically credible theory. I mean, I think part of the, I don't want to come across sounding like an arrogant academic, you know, in an ivory tower who just automatically dismisses out of hand a theory just because it's suggested by somebody who's not, you know, let's say a credentialed, you know, archaeologist. So I'm not dismissing it on those grounds alone, right? I'm not saying that this is not credible because it wasn't suggested by somebody in, you know, the inner magical circle of credentialed archaeologists. I'm dismissing it because it, in fact, goes against every piece of evidence that we have for the location of the ancient temple. So the only way you can make that argument is by misrepresenting or misinterpreting the evidence, or selectively taking pieces of evidence that to support that. And that's the reason why. And the reason why I said that about credentialed archaeologists is because this is not the way somebody who is academically trained in the field would operate, right? So no professional archaeologist would arrive at this conclusion because, you know, look, I spent a decade in graduate school.
Exactly.
I spent a decade in graduate school, right? And during that time, and, you know, many years since then, and, you know, during that time, I learned, you know, one of the things that you learn, and it's just like any other discipline, right? You learned how to work with the evidence in your particular field. And so, you know, this is why no credible professional archaeologist would accept this, because we know this isn't how, you know, the evidence doesn't support it. To explain why the evidence doesn't support it would take a whole nother couple of hours, but exactly. You know, okay. So anyway, but the point is that we do have evidence, and there is a way to correctly and incorrectly work with evidence and interpret evidence in archaeology, just like in anything else. And the evidence here does not support that at all.
Let me just say, I could not agree with you more. And that's why I wanted to get it from you, because it just seems to persist. People just keep putting this out there. And so thank you for that answer that you gave.
Yeah, some people are better at self-promotion than others too.
Exactly. So
I mean, it's easy today because there's an internet, and, you know, the internet has many good aspects to it in terms of the democratization of knowledge and access to knowledge.
That's right.
But it also does not presume that, you know, you necessarily have, this is why we rely on experts, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic here,
right?
And we rely on experts in that field to give us advice.
Right.
Because I myself am not trained in coronavirus or anything like that. I rely on the experts, the scientific experts, to tell me. And it's so, again, the parallel here is, okay, so this is an archaeological question. What do the archaeologists have to say about it?
Right. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I want to just thank you again, Professor Magness, for coming on the show. We kept you a little bit over time, but thank you so much for your incredible, great insights into some of the questions that we ask. And I'm sorry if I asked you a couple of difficult ones, but you did an awesome job as always. And folks who want to know more about Jodi, they can check her website out. It's jodimagness.org. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm an organization. The reason, by the way, is that apparently some individual, this was a long while back, many years ago, when we were first setting up my website, somebody had purchased the domain jodimagness.com. I suppose, you know, in the event that Jodi Magness in the future would want to buy that from them. So we did a thing and just did jodimagness.org. So I'm an org. Yeah.
It's great. And do you have any new books you're working on, by the way?
I am. Actually, although okay. Don't hold your breath. Well, first of all, you know, you mentioned my Qumran book, which was published back in 2002. So I updated it. It needed to be updated. I just kept putting it off. But I finally got around to updating it, and the revised and updated version is in press now, and it should be out in by the late spring, I think, is what the publisher Erdman's tells me. So that's
Great.
that's something that you can look forward to. And I am working on another book now, which don't hold your breath because it's going to take at least a couple of years till I finish it. Because anyway, it's on a small topic, Jerusalem.
Cool. Oh yeah.
Just a small topic.
Small, just yeah.
Yeah,
One of my favorite ones is this one here.
Oh, thank you. I love that book, by the way. You know, I love that
I do
book.
too.
I wrote that as a textbook for a class that I teach every spring, which I've taught for many years, because there was all the books on the, in the field go up to 586 BC and then they stop. And I started 586 BC.
I love this book. This is a fantastic, published by Cambridge University Press.
That's
Archaeology of the Holy Land, from the destruction of Solomon's temple to the Muslim conquest.
Yep.
It's got some really great images in here, some photographs, maps. So I really want to recommend to our listeners to go to Amazon or wherever you can get books. Get that book, check it out. It is excellent, great resource.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. And I'm glad to see that it's doing well. And
well, at least I use it for my class.
It's really good. It's very, very good. But thank you so much again, Jodi, for coming on Monocle and Spade podcast. Thank you for our listeners, for those of you who support Epic Archaeology and Monocle and Spade. Thank you so much. And we hope you guys are having a great week and that you are staying safe during this pandemic. But again, thank you for watching and take care.